Welcome to the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, I've got Dr. Jeff Moreno with PWR Lab as a guest. Now, PWR Lab takes a whole bunch of data points, statistics from wearable devices, including your own smartphone, finding out what it is your body does, how it moves, how it rests, and what it needs for improved performance. So follow along with the conversation we're about to have. Make sure you follow us also on Instagram, Rocky_Snyder. Click the subscribe button if you haven't already. Tell a few friends and enjoy the show. Well, we talk so much in previous episodes about wearable technology and force plate technology, but especially wearable technology. And the thing that I hear mainly from the guests is that there's just so much information out there that you could drown in the statistics and drown in the kind of information you can get from wearable tech, that you need to navigate and figure out what it is that I really want to get out of this, from sleep patterns to activity levels to heart rate and so on. Well, my guest here, Jeff Moreno, Dr. Jeff Moreno, a doctor in physical therapy who I've known for several years in the Santa Cruz area. In fact, he was one of the main physical therapists that I would often seek help or refer to with my clients or his patients and so on. But he is one of the co-founders of PWR Lab. And PWR Lab is basically taking, if I could explain it, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but taking all of the data that is collected from all of these devices, including just your smartphone, and trying to figure out what it is that the end user really needs and try to navigate to a point where the information makes sense. So, Jeff, am I right there?
Yeah, I mean that's a good general synopsis of what we do. And maybe if I analogize it a little bit, or give it a little bit more color, I think, I always think of when an athlete comes in, and I know you're the same way, Rocky. They have a story to tell, right? And if we're in front of them, it's our job to deeply understand that story, right? And so I think of every individual on this planet and especially nowadays with the amount of technology that's dripping off of everybody, from our iPhones to the watches that we use, to the cars that we drive. Everybody in essence is knowingly and unknowingly a digital storyteller. And at the foundation of those stories is our unique lived experience. And so what we do at PWR Lab is we collect that data from wearables that everybody uses, but very rarely gets stuff from. And we translate that and digitize that into value for that human and the brands that they are loyal with. We just so happen to be, my domain expertise happens to be running. And so the primary brands that we work with are running shoe brands, major running shoe brands. And so what we do is we connect that wearable data with permission from the individual to the brands. So those brands, that data and that individual's data or story can drive innovation towards personalization of products, services, and experiences that are unique to that individual. And that's really the future. And so if you can imagine, going to a shoe company and hopping on their website and you're like, man, there's 100 shoes here. I have no clue what to choose, but you have entered into their innovation program with your wearable device that you wear every time you run. And they know the time of day that you run and the weather that you're running in and the pace or velocity at which you're running. And your weight and your basic biomechanics. And the idea with with that information is that they can eventually say, hey, based on who you are and your unique digital story, here's 3 shoes that would be most appropriate for you. And not only are we going to give you this shoe that's more personal for you, but we're also going to, based on your digital story and your basic biomechanics, we're going to be also able to understand what you might be more susceptible to as it relates to running related injuries. And with that knowledge, we're also going to potentially proactively act on that by giving you a better understanding of the types of things that maybe you should work on from a strength or mobility standpoint, based on having massive amounts of data over large populations of people that we can extrapolate down to. And so that's super exciting to me, because as a practitioner, you know, trying to go from what we do as what I call the N equals 1, where I'm seeing someone in a very unique environment, one-on-one, with lots of information and detail with assessment. Can we take some of that and understand what that looks like at scale with data that people collect every day? And so that's what drives me every single day. Now, with that said, as much as I enjoy data and I enjoy thinking about the possibilities and dreaming, I'm also very much still a practitioner, and I consider that really important. It's important for me as it relates to just my internal R&D, I guess, so to speak. It helps to generate hypotheses that I get to test with in the data, or in those individuals that have access to equipment that within shoe companies, R&D individuals or sports scientists. So I still do that. I don't do a lot of it. I have a handful of athletes around the world that I continue to work with, primarily distance runners, which I still, you know, really enjoy and will never stop. So that's, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it really does. I mean, in some part, it's fascinating from like a business standpoint, where you're collaborating with shoe manufacturers to try and connect the consumer with the best possible product for their skill set. And therefore, you have just kind of created a marriage and a bond of trust between the manufacturer and the consumer, which is something that isn't a common thing these days. And it's nice to kind of reinforce that, provided that it's a symbiotic somewhat relationship. But the other thing is too, that you mentioned this, but I would love to delve a little bit deeper in the fact that you didn't gloss over it. It's just something I think you just commonly know that maybe a lot of people don't, is that the devices that we have, from the watch that you wear to the smart device used to be known as a phone, but now it's your handheld computer, and other devices are continually creating statistics and measurements, and many of those you are not even aware of. There are so many sub levels of content, of measurements, of data that are being tracked. And not, I'm not going to say like in a Big Brother, I'm sure there may be some element to that, but just in your day-to-day existence, that we are not actually taken into consideration. I don't know if we're privy to it or we're just unaware.
Yeah, but I think there's a couple components there. I think one, we're unaware of it. I think two, there's maybe some nefarious things that go on where people are tracking information without permission, and that's a really important thing for Power Lab. We do not enter into a relationship with a company that will not, in a first party way, ask for someone's data. And so they have to ask with permission. We ask them to be extremely authentic with how you're going to use it, whether it's in innovation or product development or marketing, etc. So that's really important. But I think in terms of where we are at from a technological standpoint, like we've gotten really good at amassing huge amounts of information. And so what I tell people is that we're often data rich, but insights poor. And so we have tons of data that is literally, dripping off of our phone right now. As my phone sits right here, I just picked it up, and the accelerometer within it just knew that I moved it, right? So in theory, like I can set it down at night, not touch it, and as soon as I touch it, it knows that obviously I'm awake at that point. That's a timestamp. Extracting those things for good in a way that with permission. So individuals that are extremely creative can utilize that for the benefit of you is what drives us. And that's why we call it lived experience data, because we think of it as a 24-hour cycle. And it isn't just activity data, although that's where we're starting. So I just got back from a run. That run took me 40 minutes. But that's like 40 minutes of a 24-hour cycle, right? But I also drove over the hill to go to Los Gatos. I sat in a meeting. I had to drive back. That's context. If I'm a physio, that I want to know deeper about my athlete as it relates to their life every day, whether they're traveling, how often are they traveling, their injury history. Did they break up with their significant other? How is that relationship from a psychosocial standpoint? Like there's so much rich context that's interesting. I was reading an article the other day. It's like looking at walking velocities. Walking velocities can potentially determine anxiety if someone's anxious or depressed. And so understanding or being able to proactively understand when someone's maybe not feeling that well is really interesting. And how can that important information get to the right people so that they can act on that appropriately? And so our domain is really sport, and our domain is physical activity or sports equipment companies, but the utility of information, the possibilities are really endless. I just happen to gravitate towards movement is life, and I want brands and individuals who are influencers to use their influence in a way that allows people's ability to thrive for a long time. And so, and I've talked to almost every major sports individual within every major brand. And I think brands are starting to shift, and corporations are starting to shift, in that the thinking is less about how do we shove product down people that people don't need, to how do we incentivize or try to keep people moving because it's good for them. And the product of that is they're probably going to buy a shoe to do that. So it's a different way to think about it. Is like, hey, like, what do I need to do to keep that guy healthy, happy? And how can I provide them with a service and or experience from a brand, let's say Nike, to influence that positive behavior that makes people healthier and happier. And that really excites me as a physio, as someone who loves movement, as a parent who wants kids to be more active and love movement. And so those are the things that I think are exciting that are coming down the road. I also think that at some point, that data will be so important that people will want to give you something for it. And so right now, and I have to be sort of careful with this, but right now I think, you know, brands may offer some sort of loyalty program, or, you know, but they could, you know, like a brand like Nike could say, hey, we're doing this really cool innovation, become an innovation ambassador, and people will just give away their data because they love Nike. But what if the data, their lived experience data, was so important to the economics of that brand, where it shifted, where like they become like not paid, but they're well incentivized to give or donate, or exchange their data for something that they want. And I feel like in the future, that exchange is going to happen. The tipping point is not there yet, because the technology isn't there and no one's doing this, but it's going to happen. And I'm super excited about it, because then it's in the service of the individual, not only as it benefits kind of hopefully our world, and how we treat our world, but also others, more importantly. And so these are the things
But
that
this
I dream
goes this and it's a good dream, but it goes beyond selecting footwear,
Yeah.
right? We're talking about and not just the material aspects or the consumerism portion of it, though. You said yourself you worked or met with sports scientists in all the major sports. Are you working with them to help them feed through all of the oceans of data and getting them on a course that they want to be on? I mean, is that part of Power Lab as well?
Yeah, so there's also a research side to it, which probably, and probably I personally enjoy a little bit more, because I'm interested in people solving these questions. And so one of the questions we had with the brand, and here's a practical example, is could we invite individuals into a data exchange program, capture their lived experience data, and then could we understand who is more susceptible to specific running related injuries based on their lived experience data. And so,
And what are some of the big components when you say lived experience data? Are we looking at what their turnover rate is, their distance, their volume? I mean, what is
yeah,
it?
so let's go with just the basics. So, you know, their volume, intensity, their frequency of movement, the density of that activity. We created a metric called as consistency metric that gives us the ability to understand how consistent they are, and I'll talk about that more generally because that's really important. And then our basic spatial temporal characteristics. So if we break down the equation of speed, that breaks down into stride frequency and stride length. And then if we break that down further, that breaks down into ground contact time and flight time. And so it becomes a really interesting whole body kinematic approach to looking at someone's running style. And so then what I said is, well, can we break that down even further to understand what I call ground dominance and stride dominance? And so is someone more aerial? Do they have a tendency to spend more time in the air because maybe they're a little bit more bouncy? Maybe they're a little bit more elastic. Maybe that as a result of that elasticity, they're a bit more efficient. And then are they more terrestrial? Do they spend a little bit more time on the ground? And so when we watch those runners, they have a tendency to kind of like give way to gravity. They sink, and not only at the knee and maybe at the ankle, but a lot at the hip. And there's a lot of side to side motion, and there's a lot of vertical excursion, and that can result in a lot of cost as it relates to energy, but also the demand of specific muscles or joints go up. So we said, well, if we break that down even further and simplify it even more, could we determine if someone had pain at the knee or above, or if someone was more susceptible from the knee and below? And so what we did is we took, I think we had, ended up being almost 500 individuals within this study, which is quite a bit in the natural world over a 4-month period. And what we found was those individuals who spent more time on the ground, which means that they had a longer stride, they had more knee flexion during loading, they had more vertical excursion, they had less flight time. They were significant for risk of injury at the knee, which is really cool, because we can then say that in a matter of 2 minutes downloading someone's watch data, click a button, boom, we got all their information. We can say, based on what we know, you may be more susceptible to knee pain. Now, what do we do with that? Well, you and I know, like, hey, if I knew that someone was potentially more susceptible to anterior knee pain, patellofemoral pain, I know exactly what I'm going to give them as a result of that, potentially from a capacity standpoint, from a reactive strength standpoint, maybe from a mobility standpoint. I can hypothesize about that. And so then it goes down into what I call the N=1. It gives me the opportunity to potentially, make conclusions that then in turn result in programming for someone that maybe has never stepped in my clinic, right? And so it also was positive for a specific type of lower leg issue, which is Achilles tendinopathy, which we found that was really interesting. So that kind of stuff excites me. And so we have a pretty good sized feasibility study right now with 6 universities going on. That's pretty much all digital, and that's happening right now. And so I very much enjoy those components of the things for obvious reasons. But the utility of that is, man, how cool would it be to be able to like understand someone's digital story to a point where I can potentially reduce their susceptibility to something that they may be more susceptible to based on the style of running that they have that's unique to them. That's exciting to me. And so that's a practical example. 2 other things that I think more generally for your running population or individuals that are massively important, that are almost so simple. People shake their head, but like no one is really looking at it, is what we call is the consistency thing. Those that ran at least 3 times a week, 1 month prior to coming into the study, because we had all their historical data, were at a significant less risk of running related injuries. As a result of that, their chronic load, or the amount of running or workload that they had over that month coming into the study, was also larger for obvious reasons, because they just were more consistent, right? Yeah. So we know from Gabbett that moderate to higher training loads are somewhat protective for potential injury risk, and so we also found that. So if I were to, I call it the 3 C's for my runners. I'm looking for consistency, correct loading, and that not only goes from a training standpoint, but also from a tissue capacity standpoint, and then control.
Okay.
And control relates to like the idea of one, not running too fast all the time, from a velocity or speed standpoint, but also listening to your body, which is hard to do sometimes. So consistency, correct loading, and capacity. And those are the 3 C's that I see that are pretty consistent across the board with runners.
So I'm curious with correct loading. I mean, you and I, we could geek out on gait mechanics and running mechanics till the cows come home. But correct loading, I'm interested in knowing, do you have data that you like looking at the likelihood of lower leg injuries or symptoms versus knee or hip?
Yeah.
Is there information out there that you're going, oh, okay, I see that they are so much more loaded unilaterally, or with this information, I'm extrapolating or hypothesizing that the arm drive is improper, or they have too much forward lean or whatever. Are you doing that?
Yeah. So this is where we've had to be really creative, Rocky. And this is because we don't have that granular data, but here's where it becomes really interesting. So it's taking what you and I know from a clinical perspective, anecdotally, and then it's taking those proxies that we know, that we see all the time in the clinic, so to speak, and finding proxies that correlate to really simple data and being creative with it. So let me give you an example of this. A very high profile distance runner, sponsored by a major shoe company, comes in, and I've collected her data prior to her coming in. And so what was really unusual about her is, for the speeds that she had really, really high stride frequencies, and very short stride lengths at easy paces, which is really unusual. And so stride frequency is usually is more linear with speed. So as we increase speed, we increase stride frequency. This woman had like unusually high stride frequencies that you wouldn't see at really easy paces. And so my brain was like, well, man, that's like super unusual. Why am I seeing that? Like, why is that occurring? So she comes into the clinic. I watch her move. I've seen her run. She has a very interesting gait, because you can imagine if someone's spinning their reel really fast at slow pace, it's like they're a road runner, but they're not going anywhere, right?
And it makes me think there's some restriction in their hips, honestly, that they're really coming from the knees and the lower legs.
Yeah, no restriction at all at the ankle, hip, or anything. But what's interesting is she can barely do 5 single leg heel raises body weight.
Oh, so she can't propel.
So she can't propel. So the only way that she can be fast is to move her leg faster.
Yeah.
Because she can't generate propulsive force to get longer
stride. So she has to have a great frequency.
So if the speed equation is such, we know that if I can't get longer, so speed equals stride length times stride frequency. If I can't get longer, the only thing I can do to get faster is spin my wheel faster.
Yeah.
But at some point, like that isn't going to happen. Like I can't spin my wheel infinitely fast, right? I have to get longer. So when she does get longer, the tissue load or demand at her Achilles and her foot is massive, and she can't handle that. So she had some Achilles issues, and so I'm like, oh my gosh, can I take that simple information and can I see that across larger scales of people? Just like at the moment. Yeah, I'm like, yes, I can. And then I could say, oh shoot, like this person has a serious tissue capacity, loading capacity issue, like strength issue that she needs to adjust, or she's going to probably have some sort of foot stress fracture, Achilles tendinopathy, etc. And so that was massive. That was like massive. And so So that's one theory that's being tested. The other theory at the knee, I think, is almost equally more important, because most people have 50% of runners have knee pain. But that's an easy example, or simple example, of understanding, like, thinking creatively, but also taking what we know anecdotally as a practitioner and applying that to the sports science and saying, like, what does all this mean? And can we put it together to answer a specific question, even when they're not across from us, right? And so that is like, that gets me fired up and super excited. And the utility of that across, obviously different sports is really interesting. I think most of this work probably is in European football right now from a tech standpoint. But I'm interested in taking this information. I think taking what I call low friction wearable information that everybody uses, thinking wildly, phones, thinking wildly creative about it, and then really bringing you like utility to the average person, right? And so that excites me.
So when we're talking about, you just brought up European football, right? Soccer, and that is a multi-directional running activity compared to the linear running that we've just been speaking of.
Yeah.
I mean, so I can only imagine the data is, if not 3 times greater, it's probably even more so, because we're also thinking of not only forward running, but lateral, diagonal, rotational, backwards. I mean, we've got so much more. Well, how do you work with that?
Yeah, that we haven't approached that yet, because that's really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's companies like Kitman Labs, and there's companies like Zone 7, which, those would be, Zone 7 would be a good company to talk to. So that are working on those problems, but I also think that what they know is context. They know that it isn't just about accelerations at XY phases, right? They also know that it's so much outside, as well as other things that affect someone's injury risk potentially, right? And so there's also, a lot, the injuries in European football are very different than the injuries that I see for distance runners, that are very different than the injuries we see in sprinters, right? And so what are the common denominators? What are the differences? Why are they different? I think is really interesting. Why does a distance runner never have a mid-substance hamstring issue, but a sprinter does, or a footballer? Like, for us, that's obvious. It's velocities and pelvic position and potential change of direction, but primarily velocities and pelvic position. But distance runners do have proximal hamstring injuries, which footballers don't, which is interesting. And why is that, right? And so I think, like, looking at that GPS data, which is what's collected mostly in European football, and then also adding the other contextual things to that, like sleep and whatever other subjective questionnaires or qualitative information that they're getting from their athletes on a daily basis, and combining that all together to understand from a multifactorial standpoint why someone may be at more risk, and how do I alert the sports medicine team, and then the sports medicine team having an appropriate conversation with the coaching staff. Those dynamics are what happens in European football. For me, I just text my athlete.
And are you hired by sports teams at all to be a consultant and to utilize Power Lab with their team and their performance? Is that something or a direction you're going in?
Yeah, usually I'm I consult individually with teams because they're having a hard time with a specific athlete. And so let's say an athlete, so, you know, on the physio side, let's say he's failed their rehab process for whatever reason. So a team, whether that's a Hoka team or a Bowerman team or a Brooks Beast team or whoever, you know, there's a handful of teams in elite running right now. They're sponsored by major brands. They'll reach out and say, hey, I got this athlete, or the athlete themselves will reach out and say, hey, I've been having this issue and it's longstanding, and or their physio will reach out to me, and that's how usually it happens. And I'll say, okay, hey, I want them to connect their lived experience data to our platform. Don't tell me anything about them. I just want to wrap my brain around their numbers, and so their numbers help me to understand their picture, I guess. I start to see movement based on numbers, and then it gives me an idea of like, I have this amount of context. Now I really want to talk to the coach, which adds more context. Now I really want to talk to the athlete. And then we come up with a game plan about how to do that. I also work, you know, with starting to work with USA Triathlon, more on the physio side and more on the sports science side. And so we'll go to the Olympic Training Center and do a college recruitment camp and hang out with some athletes and, you know, give my interpretation of who they are and how they are from a biopsych.
And so do you play the app game? Meaning, like, does Power Lab have an app for the general consumer, for the general population?
Not for the general. We have an app, not for the general population. The only way that the consumer gets to our app is through a major brand. And so the major brand says, hey, we have this initiative. We'd like you, the consumer, to be a part of our innovation team. Do you want to participate? You want to be a wear tester? And then they're given an opt-in page, and then the consumer can enter our app. But the app is very, it just shows their profile and it shows that they're connected to a brand. That's it. But ultimately, that the services and experiences will come from the brand through our data, but the brand is in charge of that, so to speak.
Got it. I see what you're doing in regards to the running world, and it's very similar to something like NASCAR, where you've got these motor companies that are basically trying to get the top of the line vehicles to be the leader in the auto racing world. And for you, it's foot racing. And so they're dumping so much of their resources into elevating their product to match what it is their driver in the world of auto racing needs. I mean, that's very similar. At least that's what I'm gaining from this conversation too, right?
Yeah, and you know, ultimately that driver is just everybody, whoever wants to just go out for a run, right? And
well, that's nice because it filters down. I mean, most of the safety features that we have in our average car today, when we go for a ride on the road, are directly related back to auto racing and the safety features they have there. So I can see easily the features in the running shoes trickling down to us commoners and not the elite level, Olympic level runners that you're dealing with.
Yeah, the most important is the general population, right? So personally, I may deal with, you know, the elite level athlete, but our work within Power Lab is solely to bring that information or someone's story, the person who just runs 3 days a week because they love it in a forest. It makes them feel better. Our purpose is to to make sure that they can do that for a long time, and to connect them to brands, and the brands be able to help facilitate that over time by taking their data and making it more personal for them, right? And
Sure. I love it. I love the fact that you're using the term story, because everyone is unique. Even identical twins have lived different lives,
yes,
and they've had different experiences, and
yes,
all those experiences somehow get stored in what the embodiment of the physical form is. I mean, that's
yeah,
why we look at body language, and there's different gait mechanics, and when you see a friend walking down the sidewalk with their back to you with a hoodie sweatshirt on, you still recognize them, because you can actually see through that and
yeah,
see the familiarity of their movement patterns. And so
yeah,
now you're capturing all this data, and you're saying, okay, well, if this person moves in this particular way, this
yeah,
is most likely what's going to be needed. These are the
yes,
red flags that are coming up.
yes,
I mean, you guys are doing a tremendous amount
yeah.
for every individual, and commend you for it. That's fantastic. So let's fast forward 5 years down the road. Where's Power Lab going to be?
Um, Good question. I mean, hopefully we'll be with kind of part of every brand's digital transformation, not only on a running side, but also what I just generally sports equipment side. And the other side of that is also to bring utility to this data at large. And so, at some point we already have millions and millions and millions of points of data, right? And so it's a big data problem. And so, my dream also is to bring utility to that generally, and let someone really smart, like someone at Stanford, utilize this information in an anonymized way that can also advance their research in unique ways, and or have access to individuals that maybe want to participate in their own unique research study, right? And so that also is something that we're not necessarily doing right now, but also excites me because of just my background that I enjoy.
Heck yeah.
That,
Jeff, this has been great.
and I just want to surf more, man.
You got to find a way to do that.
5 years, I want to surf more, and I want to eat tacos
that was what I was looking for. That was it. Yes.
behind my Sprinter van with my board behind me, tucked in there.
Well, we'll meet at the point and paddle out together.
For sure.
Oh, so if people want to follow Power Lab, or you yourself, Jeff, here's an opportunity to throw out your Instagrams or whatever.
Yeah, they can just find me on Instagram. I think it's jeffmarino.run. They can look us up at Power Lab, PWR.lab. Uniquely, we're going to be rebranding and changing our name, and we'll have a whole new site pretty soon, but I can't really divulge that yet, the name of that. But, if people are interested to look out, please reach out. Even if, you just want to have a chat and you love movement and you love activity and you're a sports science guy and you want to nerd out, feel free. And I want to say thank you, Rocky, for doing this. Is great. You're an amazing human. It's great to have you as a part of our community, and everybody knows Rocky if you come to Santa Cruz. So just say, hey, where's Rocky? And they'll be like, he's over at the point surfing right now.
Oh, yeah, I would say that's not far from the truth, actually. As soon as I hit stop on the record button, you know where to find me.
Yeah.
And so meet me over there, and I'll share a set wave or two with you, because we got swell on the way. Jeff, this has been great. I really appreciate it. And we'll check back in the future and see where Power Lab is headed.
Appreciate it, Rocky. Take care, man.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Zealous Podcast. I want to thank Jeff Moreno and Power Lab for coming on, sharing everything that he has so far. If you are interested in Power Lab, or just want to ask Dr. Moreno a few questions, check the description below the podcast to find out all the contact information. And until next time, make sure you keep on hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already, and click on Instagram. I'd love to hear some comments and reviews. We'll see you next week.